This is Philosophy Bites with me, David Edmonds.
And me, Nigel Warburton.
Philosophy Bites is available at www.philosophybites.com.
Philosophy Bites is made in association with the Institute of Philosophy.
Not many contemporary thinkers achieve the prominence in their lifetime of having their name mutate into an adjective. But this happened to John Rawls. Many political philosophers are proud to call themselves Rawlsian. Among academics, there's an extraordinary degree of consensus that the most important work of political philosophy from the second half of the last century was Rawls's A Theory of Justice, published in 1971. The book's influence has been felt well beyond the university campus. Its radical claim that what matters most in society is the position of the worst off has filtered through to politicians and policymakers. Jonathan Wolff is Professor of Philosophy at University College London.
Jonathan Wolff, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Very nice to be back again.
We're going to focus on John Rawls' Theory of Justice, which is probably the most famous work written in the 20th century of political philosophy. Could you tell me a bit about John Rawls, who he was?
John Rawls was an American philosopher who worked from the 1950s until the end of the century, so long working life. He concentrated on political philosophy for most of his life. He began writing important papers in political philosophy in the late 1950s and never stopped. And in a sense, still hasn't stopped because there's still more of his work being discovered even 10 years or so after his death. He was based for most of his life in Harvard. And as you say, his major work was A Theory of Justice, which was published in 1971. That was based on work he had started in the 50s. And after he finished work on A Theory of Justice, he carried on developing the view, seeing new problems, seeing solutions, new applications, and so on. So it was really his life's work.
But what was the key idea in this book?
Well, Rawls put forward what looks at first sight a very simple theory of justice. He put forward what he called his two principles of justice. In fact, there are three of them, so it's quite a mystery why he called them the two principles. But anyway, the first of Rawls's principles is known as the liberty principle, which says that each person is entitled to an equal and extensive set of basic liberties. So these are rights, civil rights and political rights. Everyone is entitled to the sorts of liberties that one tends to get in liberal, highly developed societies. The second principle gets a bit more interesting. It splits into two. One of them is known as the difference principle, and the other is the fair opportunity principle. The fair opportunity principle, again, seems rather bland. It says that everyone is entitled to fair equality of opportunity. But the difference principle is where things get interesting. And the difference principle is a principle about the distribution of income and wealth in society. Now, Rawls's view is that there is a sense in which fairness requires an equal distribution of income and wealth. But, he says, it may be that inequalities in society could be to everyone's benefit. For example, if you have a competitive economy with higher wages going to very productive people, this could bring out incentives that could make everyone better off. So his view is that fairness, in a sense, requires equality, but if everyone, literally everyone, would be better off by inequality, then inequality is justified. And here is the difference principle. The difference principle says inequalities are justified only if they make the worst off as well off as possible. So this is Rawls's really distinctive contribution to political philosophy.
But he didn't just pluck these ideas out of the air, did he? I mean, he had a particular way of arriving at these conclusions.
That's right. Though when you say he didn't pluck them out of the air, one way of understanding that is, well, someone must have had those ideas before he did. And another is, well, he must have had arguments for them. Now, Rawls, particularly as he got beyond his earliest works, was very respectful to the traditions in political philosophy. And if he could possibly attribute any of his ideas to anyone else, he would do. He was, in a way, the opposite to many of us. He didn't seem to crave originality. He craved the reverse. So he tried to stick his ideas on other people. And he could do that with the liberty principle to some degree and the opportunity principle. But one of the remarkable things is, not even Rawls could find anyone who'd held the difference principle. A lot of people thought that inequalities were justified if they were to the advantage of the worst off. So it was a common thing to say in the 1940s, for example, by British Labour politicians, that inequalities are justified if they make all of us better off. But Rawls added this further twist. It's not enough that they should make us all better off. They've got to make the worst off as well off as possible. So this is Rawls' really distinctive idea.
But how did he get to that position? I mean, what mode of reasoning led him to that conclusion?
Well, this is what is so interesting about Rawls, in that he didn't just have a radical theory, a new theory. He had a radical new argument. Rawls realizes how difficult it is to argue for any principle in political philosophy. But in Rawls's case, he used the method of a hypothetical contract, or also known as the original position. Rawls's idea is that quite often people disagree about justice because they're biased by their own interests. So if I knew that I was rich, I might be very much against taxation. If I knew I was poor, I might be very much in favour. Who's right, the rich person or the poor person? Rawls's response to this is to say, well, let's take these two people and let us imagine that they don't know whether they're rich or poor. Could they then come to an agreement of some sort? So what type of taxation would you like in your society if you didn't know whether you were rich or poor? Would you agree to racial discrimination in your society if you didn't know what race you were? Would you agree to sexual discrimination if you didn't know what sex you were? So Rawls's basic idea is to say, let us strip things that could bias people from them, in imagination, of course. So you have to imagine yourself stripped of anything that might lead you to be prejudiced in your own favour. So Rawls says, let's imagine people getting together, but they don't know how wealthy they are, they don't know what race they are, they don't know what sex they are, they don't even know what he calls their conception of the good is, what they like in life. And then he says, well, how would these people design society? What principles of justice would people in this hypothetical contract situation, behind what he calls the veil of ignorance, what would they agree to?
So in this imaginary case, I'm behind the veil of ignorance. I don't know what position I'm going to occupy in society. And that's what he calls the original position. I have to think through what principles would create a fair society in that situation. Is that right?
Well, it's half right. It was right up until the last point when you said the people behind the veil of ignorance have to ask themselves what would be a fair society. In fact, Rawls says the veil of ignorance itself ensures fairness. What these people should be asking is what, in their selfish interest, they would want. So if you didn't know what your role in society was going to be, how would you selfishly want society to be designed? If you didn't know whether you were going to be a dustman or a manual worker, or whether you were going to be a city banker, what wage differentials would you think would be the right ones to have in your society between the city banker and the manual worker? Possibly not the ones we've got at the moment.
So Rawls has got these radical conclusions here about, in general terms, how we structure society. This is what he thinks we'll choose in that position of ignorance. But how does it cash out? Does it mean there won't be opera? People won't be able to go on holiday to the Bahamas? What are the conclusions there?
Well, the principles are at a fairly abstract and high level. They're principles to structure what he calls the basic structure of society. They're not meant to be principles that guide our day-by-day behaviour. So Rawls himself doesn't say that you as an individual have a moral duty to make the worst off as well off as possible. He's not telling you to give your money away. That will be dealt with by the tax system for him. So for us, we will have all the freedoms under Rawls in society that we have now. So there could be opera if people want it and prepared to pay for it, maybe even if people want to vote for it. But the main thing that Rawls wants to do is to say, at an even deeper level than the Constitution, we should be governed by these very strong ideas. There should be equal liberty, that there should be fair opportunities for everyone, and we should arrange our economic institutions so that the worst off are as well off as possible.
That's the theory. Now, there are objections that can be laid against this, surely, aren't there? For instance, it's not obvious to me that I wouldn't want the opportunity of a big payoff. I might want to gamble from my position behind the veil of ignorance, because it'd be quite nice to end up with a ticket for the lottery there. You might just win.
So this is a criticism that Rawls faced probably from the first day he ever wrote his theory, that what he's doing is saying that behind the veil of ignorance, you should really play very, very safe. You should try to arrange things so that the worst off is as well off as possible. And you're saying, well, maybe it was worth a bit of a gamble, that maybe I could gamble a little bit for the sake of great wealth. And wouldn't it be rational for me to do this? And in particular, utilitarian critics of Rawls said, well, why shouldn't we gamble quite considerably? Isn't it rational to gamble under some circumstances, even if you know you can lose? Now, what Rawls did later on in his work was to try to clarify the difference between his view and the utilitarian. First of all, he says, well, what are you prepared to gamble with? Of course, you talk about gambling with your money. Would you gamble with your liberties? Would you gamble with your opportunities? Rawls thinks it's not rational to gamble with your liberties or opportunities. And so he says the liberty principle and the opportunity principle are fairly resistant to the gambling argument. So Rawls says the first victory against utilitarianism is to establish the liberty principle and the opportunity principle. Having done that, he says, well, maybe someone will come back and say we should have a mixed principle of justice, which says we should have the liberty principle and the opportunity principle, and then a utilitarian principle for distributing money. Now, Rawls's first answer to that is that this is just too risky, that if you really were in the original position and you had to think about your total life prospects, it would be irrational to take a big risk. If you're risking your livelihood for the sake of a lottery gain, this is ridiculous because you could end up in the gutter. Now, there's an obvious reply to this, which is to say, well, okay, let's rule out the grave risks then. Let's just have a safety net. So instead of making the worst off as well off as possible, why not have the liberty principle, the opportunity principle, a safety net, and then a bit of utilitarianism for gambling? Even so, Rawls still thinks it would be more rational to go for the difference principle in the original position. Partly, I think this may be a view about money not being terribly important after all, some sort of rather romantic socialist view. Once people have got enough, why should they strive for more? And that may be fair enough. If you do have a high minimum, why would you want to gamble some of that for the sake of greater gain? So in the end, I think it would come down to a matter of temperament. So the argument for the difference principle is not, in my view, stone cold, but it's pretty good.
As I understand it, John Rawls gave precedence to liberty above all his other principles. Why was that?
It's a hard thing to argue for. But the sorts of examples that he uses or other people have used concern things like the justification of slavery or more recently apartheid in South Africa. Some people argued that white rule in South Africa was actually better for the blacks because of economic prosperity. And so it was actually better for black people not to have the vote. And this is an argument that's been made time and time again. If poor people are given the vote, they will mess things up. Now, you might argue against that on the grounds of saying, well, this empirically isn't true. Give black people in South Africa the vote and they'll behave very responsibly. But Rawls's answer would be, well, that's not the criteria. That if people don't have the vote, if they're not given basic political liberties, if they're discriminated against, then that is enough reason to change the system, not resting everything just on the economic prosperity.
That seems to me to suggest another criticism of Rawls, that basically you're imagining this original position, but who's doing the imagining? Probably a bunch of liberal philosophers in Harvard or wherever in a seminar, and they have overlapping value systems. We're not talking about a bunch of fascists here. What would they choose? The structure of this thought experiment actually allows you to smuggle in your prejudices.
Well, that's a very important question. The basic motivation for Rawls's theory, in my view, is the thought that ignorance is a way of modelling impartiality. So if you make people ignorant of certain things, they have no choice but be impartial. But you have the question, as you say quite rightly, well, what should you be made ignorant of? You're made ignorant of your race, of your sex, of your earning power. But why those things? If you're being made ignorant of what Rawls calls your conception of the good, the things you like in life, well, you don't know that you even like liberty or opportunity. And so how can you make a choice at all? So what Rawls says is, well, we've got to assume people value what he calls the primary goods. And the primary goods are, roughly speaking, liberty, opportunity, what he calls the social bases of self-respect, and money, income and wealth. And Rawls's justification for this is that these are the things that you would value, whatever else you valued in life. So whatever your conception of the good, whatever you want out of life, liberty, opportunity, and money, and the social basis of self-respect are all-purpose means for achieving that.
But surely there are people who've got completely different conceptions of the good, like a monk, for instance, who wants to spend a spiritual life meditating, not concerned with money in the least. Money would even enter into his world.
Money might even be an obstacle. it is true there are some people who choose to be monks. Rawls would say, and they've chosen to be monks. They weren't forced to be monks. They had that decision. Therefore, they valued liberty. They valued the liberty to be a monk. They valued the opportunity to be a monk. If they weren't given that opportunity, that would have been a problem for them. It is true that they may not want to have wealth, but nevertheless, they might still want to live in a society where the worst off are as well off as possible. I mean, monks do good works. They want to try to improve the material conditions of other people, even if they opt out themselves on the whole. So Rawls, I think, could say, look, these are all-purpose means. But I think there's a residual worry here. The monk may value a type of community whereby there's a notion of social solidarity or collective or common good. And it's less clear that opportunity, liberty, and money are ways of achieving common goods. So this was a criticism made by Michael Sandel and other communitarians, that the theory of John Rawls is biased towards liberal, individualistic conceptions of the good.
Rawls's theories have been tremendously influential in academic circles, but did they actually change anything politically?
Well, it's always hard to trace the connection between ideas and practice. There was a time in maybe the early 80s, at this conference of the SDP, there was a proposal made to adopt Rawls's theory as the official philosophy of the SDP. This was turned down on the grounds that no one could understand it. But Gordon Brown has read Rawls. The current crop, both of Labour and Conservative politicians, many of them studied Rawls and have taken in Rawls's ideas. And I think if you look across public policy now, there is a special concern for the worst off in society. That if you think about what it is to be a failing society, it's to fail the worst off, that there will be a group that are excluded, people who've not got a stake in society. So broadly across politics, at least in Europe, and maybe now in America, although things have been rather different there over the last decade, but there's a particular concern with how the worst off are faring and important programs to improve that. Furthermore, within the civil service, until fairly recently, a type of utilitarianism was dominant. The civil servants were very interested in cost-benefit analysis. They were interested in promoting programs if the benefits outweighed the costs. This is still true, but there is a concern for the worst off, and there's a concern for the distribution of benefits. So a few years ago, the Treasury here introduced into the Green Book, its official guidance, a type of weighting system so that benefits to the poor were counted as greater than benefits to the rich, which is a type of Rawlsianism.
So Rawls probably has had an impact on the real world of politics, but he has surely had a huge impact on political philosophy. I mean, I wonder if you could just summarise what that is.
Well, I think we can date political philosophy, at least in the 20th century, to pre-Rawls and post-Rawls. Between Mill and Rawls, there's nothing of the same stature. So you can spend a life, and people have, as a scholar of Rawls. Very few political philosophers between Mill and Rawls for whom that would have been a sensible way of spending your time. What Rawls did was completely change the mood in political philosophy. His first substantive papers came out in the 1950s. To understand the impact, it's quite interesting to look at what else was going on at the same time. We were in the late legacy of logical positivism and ordinary language philosophy. Most work in political philosophy was a matter of pretending, really, to clarify terms. There would be books called The Vocabulary of Politics, papers called The Grammar of Something. And so you had this really moribund state of political philosophy, it seems to me. And then you read Rawls' first paper, and here's someone who has got a theory, and he's got an argument for it. So those two things, the theory and the argument, were quite unique, and to have it to be systematic and plausible was absolutely unheard of for 100 years.
Jonathan Wolff, thank you very much.
My pleasure, thank you.
And you can hear more Philosophy Bites at www.philosophybites.com.